She agreed to $500 a month. That number was not defeat, it was bait. Eternal diary.
The courthouse smelled like toner cartridges and old carpet. The kind of industrial gray smell that clings to fluorescent-lit hallways, and the backs of wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting very still while their lives were being decided. Vivian Cole noticed it the way she had noticed everything since coming back, with a precision that bordered on clinical, every detail cataloged, every sensation filed and cross-referenced against a memory that should not have existed. She had sat in this hallway before, not in this life, in the other one, the first one, the one that ended on a Tuesday in February, with her car wrapped around a guardrail on Route 9, the steering that had been serviced 3 weeks prior, failing at 62 miles per hour on a dry road with excellent visibility. She had not survived that crash. And then, inexplicably, impossibly, she had woken up in her own bed 18 months earlier, gasping, with the particular quality of morning light she recognized as October, the smell of coffee from the kitchen below, and Daniel's voice on the phone in the hallway, low and careful, the way it always was when he was talking to Serena. Vivian had lain completely still in that bed for 6 minutes. She had counted. Then she had gotten up, walked to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for a very long time, and made a decision. That decision was sitting across from her now in the form of Daniel Cole, 41 years old, third-generation wealth, out a face that photographers had always called architectural, and eyes that had been watching her across the conference table for the past 40 minutes with the specific brand of pity that men reserve for women they believe have been defeated. He was wearing the charcoal suit, the one with the faint chalk stripe that his mother had bought him for his father's funeral. He wore it whenever he needed to project solemnity without effort. She knew all his costumes now. Next to him sat Jeffrey Hale, senior partner at Hale Whitmore and Associates. No relation to her maiden name, which had always struck her as a minor cosmic joke. With his reading glasses perched at the end of his nose, and a settlement agreement printed on cream-colored paper that probably cost 40 cents a sheet, Jeffrey Hale believed he had negotiated a triumph. He had spent 3 sessions convincing Daniel that the terms were favorable, that Vivian's reluctance to engage a proper attorney was a sign of psychological fragility following the marriage's collapse, that the number she had agreed to was an act of surrender. He was not entirely wrong about the number. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. On Vivian's side of the table sat Renata Marsh, whom she had hired 8 months ago, the week after Daniel had sat her down in the living room of the house on Caldwell Drive and told her, with the measured gentleness of a man who had rehearsed, that the marriage was not working. Renata was 47, formerly of the Forensic Accounting Division at the IRS. Marsh, now a family law attorney with a subspecialty that her website described as asset recovery in high net worth dissolution. She wore no jewelry except a single gold ring on her right hand that she had explained once belonged to her grandmother. She had a habit of clicking her pen exactly twice before she spoke, and she had not clicked it yet today, which meant she was still listening, still absorbing, still waiting. Renata was the most dangerous person in this room. Only Vivian knew that. "I think we're in agreement on the major terms," Jeffrey said, spreading his hands across the table in a gesture of collegial generosity. "The house stays with Mr. Cole, given that it was purchased with premarital assets. The joint accounts are split 50-50 as of the filing date. Ms. Cole retains her personal vehicle and personal effects. And the spousal support arrangement is as discussed, $500 per month for a period not to exceed 36 months. He said $500 per month with the faintest compression of his lips, the way you might mention a charitable donation that fell slightly below expectations. He was embarrassed by the smallness of it, which Vivian found privately funny. Jeffrey Hale had a reputation for aggressive advocacy. The number offended his professional aesthetic. Daniel, to his credit, did not smirk. He was too careful for smirking. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, a loosening, almost imperceptible, that she had learned to read in the way a naturalist learns to read the behavior of a specific animal. He thought this was over. He thought she was taking the money because she had no choice. Maybe because the 8 years of her marriage had reduced her to the kind of woman who could be settled with $500 a month and a handshake. Vivian looked at the settlement agreement on the table and thought about a Tuesday in February. She thought about the specific way a steering column fails when certain bolts have been incompletely retorqued during a routine service appointment. She thought about the service record she had quietly obtained from the mechanic's shop 6 months ago, the one she had scanned and encrypted and sent to 3 separate email addresses, one of which was Renata's. She thought about the $4,147,000 that was currently distributed across a series of holding companies, shell accounts, and a single offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands under the name of a real estate entity called Solace Pacific Holdings, LLC, which Daniel believed she did not know existed, and which Jeffrey Hale believed was sealed tight enough to survive any standard asset discovery process. Standard. "The terms are acceptable," Vivian said. Her voice was steady. She had worked on that. In the months following her return, her rebirth, her impossible second draft, she had discovered that the most important discipline was not the planning. The planning was almost easy once you understood what had happened to you, once you stopped grieving the first life and started studying it. The discipline was in the voice, in the flat, unreadable surface, in the art of performing the version of yourself that your enemy expected to see. Daniel expected to see a woman who was quietly broken, who had loved him with the particular unguarded quality that she had, in fact, possessed in the first life. Who had believed, even at the end, even as the distance between them grew to something structural and cold, that the problem could be solved with enough effort. He expected to see her grief, and he had seen it. She had performed it carefully, let it surface at the right moments, let him believe that the $500 represented the ceiling of her ambition for herself. She signed the agreement. Renata signed as witness. The pen made a clean sound against the cream paper. And then Renata clicked her pen twice and said, "Before we conclude, there is one additional matter." Vivian had met Renata Marsh through a woman named Claudette Osei, and who ran a financial literacy nonprofit in the South Ward, and who had once described Renata, over bad coffee in a community center kitchen, as the lawyer you hire when you already know where the body is buried, and you need someone who can prove it was murder. Claudette had meant it figuratively. In Vivian's case, the metaphor was not entirely clean. She had not gone to the police about the steering column. She had considered it. In the first weeks after her return, lying awake in the house on Caldwell Drive, while Daniel slept 3 feet away, she had rehearsed the conversation dozens of times in her mind. Walking into the precinct, sitting across from a detective, explaining that she had died in a car accident that had not yet happened, that she had evidence of asset concealment that had not yet been concealed, that her husband was planning, or had planned in a timeline she had already lived through, to ensure she would not survive long enough to contest a divorce settlement. She could not prove any of it. Not yet. Not in a way that would hold. What she could do was wait, and watch, and rebuild. The day after she woke up, October 3rd, 18 months before the courthouse, Vivian had started keeping a journal. Not a diary in the sentimental sense, a ledger. She wrote down every conversation she could remember from the first life, every name Daniel had mentioned, every business trip with its dates and stated destinations, every time he had come home smelling like the particular cedar and vetiver combination that she had eventually, too late, identified as Serena Vance's perfume. She wrote down the name of Daniel's accountant, and a man named Robert Fitch, who wore bow ties and drove a Prius and had the capacity for creative bookkeeping that only became apparent when you understood the structure of Daniel's various holding entities. She wrote down the dates of Daniel's calls with Jeffrey Hale, which she had discovered in the first life only after the divorce was finalized. In the phone records she had been too numb to examine at the time. She had been a different person in the first life. That was the only way to describe it. Not weaker, exactly. She had never been weak, but undefended, open in a way that left surface area for damage. Oh, she had loved Daniel in the way that people love things they built from materials that seemed solid at the time, with a confidence in the structure that made the collapse feel like a personal failure rather than an engineering problem. After the crash, if there had been an after in any real sense, she supposed she would have died believing she had failed somehow, that she had been insufficient, that if she had been different, sharper, more watchful, less willing to accept the explanations that arrived slightly too smoothly, things might have resolved differently. She did not think that way anymore. The Vivian who woke up on October 3rd had no patience for that particular architecture of self-blame. She had been killed. Possibly, probably, deliberately. She had been married to a man who had been conducting a long-running financial fraud against their marital estate, while simultaneously maintaining a 4-year relationship with his company's chief operating officer. He had planned to divorce her and offer her a settlement so inadequate that she would have spent the next decade of her life rebuilding from nothing, too depleted and too uninformed about the asset concealment to do anything about it. And then, when she had somehow found the thread, when she had started asking questions in February, just weeks before the crash, something had happened to her steering column. She had no proof of the last part. She still didn't. But she had the service record, and she had Robert Fitch's name. And she had the account statements she had photographed on Daniel's home office desk on a Sunday morning in November when he was at a squash match. And she had 18 months of watching and waiting and building a case that was no longer about surviving a divorce. It was about something more precise than that. It was about making sure that when this was over, there was nothing left of Daniel Cole's financial architecture. Not the shell companies, not the offshore trust, not the carefully maintained fiction that he was a moderately successful real estate developer with a pleasant home and a divorce settlement he could afford on his declared income. She wanted the entire structure taken apart, piece by piece, in the most public and legally irrefutable way possible, which was why she had agreed to $500 a month. Just the morning she first met with Renata, Vivian had arrived at the office on Prospect Avenue 20 minutes early and sat in the waiting area reading a year-old copy of a financial magazine and listening to the particular quality of the quiet. The office was on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a textile manufacturer's headquarters, and the exposed brick walls retained a faint industrial chill even in the artificial warmth of the heating system. The receptionist was a young man named Marco, who had offered her coffee with the focused courtesy of someone who had been explicitly trained not to ask why people were there. She had taken the coffee. She always took the coffee. It was a small habit she had developed in the months since her return, accepting small things. Not as warmth or gratitude, but as data. And the way people offered small things told you a great deal about the culture they were operating in. Renata had appeared in the doorway of her office at exactly the appointment time, not a minute before or after. She was a compact woman with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent years being the quietest person in rooms full of people who were shouting. "Ms. Cole," she had said, and her tone was neither warm nor cold. It was calibrated, professional, the tone of someone who understood that new clients came in various states of damage, and that the most useful thing she could offer at the start was neutrality. They had sat across from each other in Renata's office, which contained 3 diplomas, a whiteboard covered in indecipherable notations, and a single plant on the windowsill that was thriving with the specific health of something that received consistent care. Vivian had opened her bag and placed a 9-page document on the desk between them. "I've prepared a summary," she said. "I know that's unusual, but I've been researching this for some time, and I want to make sure we're starting from the same understanding." Renata had looked at the document without touching it. "Most clients bring emotions," she said. "Some bring boxes of papers. You brought a summary. I find summaries more efficient. What's your professional background?" "I was in pharmaceutical supply chain management for 6 years before I stopped working. My husband's income was sufficient, and he preferred—" She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because she was choosing the precise word, "a particular domestic arrangement. He preferred you at home. He preferred to know where I was." Renata had looked at her for a moment, then picked up the document. She read for 11 minutes without speaking. Vivian drank her coffee and watched the plant on the windowsill and thought about Robert Fitch's bow ties and the way Daniel had come home from squash matches with his hair slightly damp and his face slightly too composed for a man who had simply played squash. "Solace Pacific Holdings," Renata said, without looking up. "Registered in the Cayman Islands. Set up approximately 4 years ago. The beneficial owner of record is a man named Thomas Wren, who is Daniel's college roommate and currently listed as a partner in a consulting firm that has no discernible client base. And I believe Thomas Wren's beneficial ownership is nominal." "What makes you believe that?" "Because the initial capitalization of Solace Pacific came from a series of transfers that I traced through 2 domestic LLCs, Caldwell Property Group and Blue Ridge Capital Advisors, both of which Daniel controls. The transfers happened over 18 months in amounts just under the reporting threshold. The total capitalization was approximately $3.2 million at the time of formation. Based on the asset growth I've been able to estimate, the current value is likely between $3.8 and $4.2 million. Renata finally looked up. You traced this yourself. I have access to certain records. Some of them are public. Some I obtained through legitimate means. Define legitimate. I photographed documents in my own home. Documents that belong to your husband. Documents that belong to the marital estate. There was a pause. Renata clicked her pen once, not twice, just once, and set it down. Ms. Cole, she said, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that the purpose of the question is not to judge your answer, but to understand what I'm working with. Go ahead. Why are you agreeing to $500 a month? Vivian had thought about how to answer this for a long time, not because she didn't know the answer, but because there were several true answers and she needed to give the right one. Because Jeffrey Hale is very good at standard asset discovery, she said, and this is not a standard asset situation. What if I push hard on the settlement negotiation? If I come in asking for 30% of disclosed marital assets, Jeffrey will manage the disclosure process carefully, and we'll get clean books and a number that looks reasonable on paper, but reflects none of the actual wealth. I'll get maybe $200,000 and a monthly support payment that disappears after 3 years. And Daniel walks away with everything he's built since he decided to hide it. And if you accept the inadequate settlement, then Daniel believes the threat is over. He stops being careful. And we have time to build a case for financial fraud in the marital estate. Not just asset concealment for the divorce, but a pattern of fraudulent transfer that predates the separation. Oh, that's a different legal instrument entirely. Renata had been quiet for a long moment. The heating system made a small clicking sound somewhere in the wall. On the windowsill, the plant didn't move. If we establish fraudulent transfer, Renata said, the settlement agreement is voidable. Yes. And we can go back to the court with full documentation of the actual marital estate. Yes. The $500 a month, Renata said slowly, is not the settlement. It's the rope. Vivian picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. He thinks it's the ending, she said. I need him to think that for a little longer. The first life had given her Daniel in the form of a dinner party. His cousin Marcus had introduced them at a rooftop event for a nonprofit that raised money for urban green space. And Daniel had been standing by the railing with a glass of wine that he hadn't been drinking, looking at the city skyline with the particular expression of a man who was comfortable in his own company. She had found that attractive. Later, she would understand that it wasn't self-possession, but disconnection. He was not at peace with himself in those moments. He was simply absent, unreachable in a way she had mistaken for depth. But she had not known that then. They had dated for 2 years and married in an outdoor ceremony in September. She had worn a dress that her mother helped her choose, and she had cried at the vows, not performatively, but genuinely, because she had believed every word. The house on Caldwell Drive had been his from before, a wedding gift from his father's estate. And she had learned to inhabit it in the way that women sometimes learn to inhabit spaces that predate them. Carefully, adding small, personal objects as a kind of quiet colonization, understanding that the house would never be entirely hers, but choosing to love it anyway. She had been good at loving things that weren't quite hers. Daniel had relied on that. The pharmaceutical supply chain job she had given up in the 2nd year of the marriage. There was no argument about it, no ultimatum. It had happened through a series of small accommodations that each seemed reasonable in isolation and that amounted, in aggregate, to the elimination of her professional life. She had been making $62,000 a year, not a spectacular salary, but hers, earned through an expertise she had built over 6 years. Generating a specific kind of self-knowledge that comes from being competent at something difficult. Without it, she had found herself reorganizing closets. She had not been unhappy, exactly. She had built a life inside the life, had volunteered at a community garden, had read widely, had maintained friendships with women she admired. She had been present in her marriage in a way that she now understood Daniel had found useful, but had never found threatening. She was not a woman he had needed to manage. She was a woman he had been able to ignore. She had not known about Serena Vance until the 3rd year of the marriage. Or rather, she had not known that she knew. There had been signs, of course, the kind that become obvious in retrospect. The cedar and vetiver perfume, the particular quality of distraction in Daniel's evenings, and as the way his phone was always face down. She had filed these things in a mental category she had labeled, without quite admitting it to herself, "not my business," which was the category she had constructed to protect the life she had chosen to believe in. Serena was 43, trim and precise, with a professional reputation built on genuine competence and a personal style that Vivian had found when she finally looked her up online in the first life, approximately 1 week before the accident, to be exactly what Daniel would have chosen if he had been designing a woman to want. She was the opposite of Vivian in the specific ways that allowed a man to convince himself the comparison was flattering to both of them. In the second life, Vivian had looked Serena Vance up in the first week of October, but read everything publicly available about her and filed it all with the flat efficiency of someone processing a business intelligence report. Serena was not her enemy. Serena was a variable in a financial structure, and the most useful thing Vivian could know about her was whether she was a beneficiary of that structure or merely an adjacent participant. The answer, it turned out, was both. Serena's name appeared in the operating agreements of both Caldwell Property Group and Blue Ridge Capital Advisors, not as a managing member, but as a consultant, which Renata would later describe as the organizational equivalent of a fingerprint at a crime scene. She had been paid consulting fees totaling approximately $340,000 over 4 years, amounts that Daniel had routed through the LLCs as business expenses, and that Robert Fitch had characterized in the company financials as market research and strategic advisory services. What services Serena had actually provided to the market research operations of a mid-tier regional real estate holding company was a question that Renata's investigators had spent considerable time on. The answer was none that could be documented, which meant the $340,000 was income. Unreported, improperly classified income flowing from entities that were themselves funded by transfers from the marital estate, which meant that Serena Vance had, without perhaps fully understanding what she was participating in, accepted money that belonged in part to Vivian Cole. Vivian did not find this satisfying in the way she might have expected. She had, in the months of the second life, examined her feelings about Serena with the same clinical precision she applied to everything else, and had arrived at a conclusion that surprised her with its coldness. She did not feel betrayed by Serena. Serena owed her nothing. What Serena had done was stupid and potentially criminal, but it was Daniel's fraud, not Serena's. Serena was collateral. What she felt, when she allowed herself to feel anything, was a very precise and very contained anger about the years she had spent in a house that was never hers, building a life around a man who had been systematically looting her future, who had decided at some point that she was too much trouble to manage indefinitely, and had begun, in however gradual a way, planning for a world in which she did not exist. She kept that anger in a very small, very secure place inside her chest. It was what she ran on. The 8 months between hiring Renata and the courthouse had a texture to them that Vivian could feel now, looking back, as something like controlled patience. The feeling of holding a very fine wire taut in both hands and walking a very long distance without letting it go slack or snap. She had continued to live in the house on Caldwell Drive with Daniel during the first 4 months of the official separation, which Jeffrey Hale had proposed and Daniel had agreed to with the kind of cooperative reasonableness that men perform when they believe they have already won. It was an unusual arrangement. Most couples separated physically from the start, but Vivian had suggested it, framing it as a cost-saving measure during the settlement process, and Daniel had agreed because he believed she was trying to preserve the financial comfort she was about to lose, and because he had moved Serena into a serviced apartment on the other side of the city 3 months prior and had no immediate need for the Caldwell Drive house to himself. She had spent those 4 months being very quiet and very useful. She had cooked dinner twice a week because it gave her access to conversations that happened in the kitchen. She had been pleasant at the 2 dinner parties they attended together as a separating couple because it established in the social record that she was cooperative and unburdened by hostility. She had asked Daniel once about the performance of his investment portfolio, of framing it as a concern about her own financial planning, and he had answered in the way that people answer questions they find slightly amusing, briefly, a little condescending, with the implicit confidence of someone who is not worried about the person asking. She had learned two things from that conversation: the name of a third LLC she had not previously known about, and the name of a bank in Singapore that Daniel apparently used for certain client transactions. She had written both down that evening in the journal she kept in a locked box under the bed she now slept in alone, since Daniel had moved to the guest room with the cheerful pragmatism of someone relieved not to have to maintain a performance anymore. She had felt nothing about that. The bed was more comfortable without him in it. She slept better. Her dreams, which had been fractured and strange in the first weeks after her return, had settled into something almost functional. She dreamed sometimes about the crash, about the specific quality of sound that a car makes when the steering gives way. A silence more than a sound, a removal of resistance, the wheel going suddenly and terribly weightless in her hands. She would wake from those dreams and lie still and feel her heartbeat slow down and remind herself, with a precision that bordered on ritual, "You are here. You came back. You have the wire in your hands." In month 5, she moved out of the house and into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building 6 blocks from Renata's office. The apartment had no particular virtues except that the water pressure was good and the windows faced east, which meant she woke up to genuine light, rather than the gray-filtered secondary illumination of the Caldwell Drive house, which had always been slightly dark, the tall trees on the property blocking the direct sun and creating, especially in winter, the impression of living in permanent late afternoon. She had taken very little from the house: clothes, her laptop, a few books, a coffee maker. She had left behind the furniture, the art, the accumulated domestic evidence of 8 years, not because she was being generous, but because she did not want any of it. It had all been assembled around a version of her life that no longer existed, and she found that she could not look at any of it without experiencing a very specific cognitive dissonance. Not grief, exactly, but the mild vertigo of seeing an old photograph of a room you once lived in, from which you are conspicuously absent. The apartment, by contrast, had nothing in it that wasn't hers. She had chosen every object with a consciousness of ownership that she found, to her slight surprise, restorative. A lamp she liked, a rug that was the right color, coffee cups that fit her hands. She had started sleeping 8 hours a night. She had started 3 months into the apartment, running in the mornings, not because she had ever been a runner, but because she discovered that it worked. The specific brutality of putting your body through something difficult before 7 a.m. had a way of clarifying everything that came after. She ran 4 miles, the same route every morning, through a neighborhood that was doing the slow work of transforming itself. Old light industrial buildings becoming restaurants and studios. Vacant lots being contested between development interests and community gardens. She found the transformation interesting, in the abstract way she found most things interesting now, as a structural problem being solved over time by competing forces. That was her life after the return, the world as a series of structural problems, everything reducible, if you looked long enough, to competing forces and the question of which one had more leverage. Robert Fitch wore bow ties and drove a Prius, and had been doing Daniel's personal and business accounting for 11 years. He was not, by most measures, a dishonest man. He was a careful man who had, so at some point in a relationship that had started as legitimate professional service, been asked to accommodate certain structures that he understood were not entirely above board, and who had agreed to accommodate them in the way that careful men sometimes agree to uncomfortable things. Gradually, incrementally, each step small enough to seem like an extension of a step already taken, until you were standing somewhere you would never have chosen as a destination. Renata had identified this about Robert Fitch in the first month of her investigation. She had reviewed 11 years of his work, or rather, 11 years of the public-facing outputs of his work, the filings and disclosures and corporate records that were accessible through proper legal channels, and she had described her findings to Vivian in a single crisp sentence. He's not the architect, he's the contractor who built the wall to spec and stopped asking what was behind it. This was useful information. A man who was not an architect was a man who could be persuaded, under the right conditions of legal pressure, to describe the specifications. Renata did not pursue Robert Fitch directly. That was not the play. The play was the forensic accounting work, the deep methodical reconstruction of the money's movements through the various shells and holding entities that would make his cooperation redundant if he refused, and his cooperation valuable if he agreed. Either way, she was building a case that didn't depend on anyone's willingness to talk. She had hired, as a subcontractor, a forensic accountant named Patrick C.O., who had previously worked for the SEC's Enforcement Division and who had the particular gift of being able to read a corporate financial structure the way a diagnostician reads an X-ray. Not just seeing what was there, but seeing what the structure was designed to conceal and what its negative space implied. Patrick had spent 3 months on the Solace Pacific Holdings matter before he came to Renata's office with a single page of handwritten notes and said, in the flat tone of someone who had stopped being surprised by human financial creativity, the $4 million isn't the whole picture. Vivian had been in that meeting. She had sat very still. There's a secondary structure, Patrick said, setting the page on Renata's desk with the care of someone placing evidence. Solace Pacific is the repository, but the funding mechanism, the way the money gets there, goes through a series of what look like legitimate real estate transactions. Property purchases and sales that are real, documented, recorded in county assessors' offices. The values are manipulated, but the transactions are real, which means there's a paper trail that looks clean from the outside. How are the values manipulated? Renata asked. Paired transactions with related parties. Blue Ridge Capital Advisors buys a property from an entity that Thomas Wren controls for above market value. That inflated purchase price is funded partly by the marital estate through Caldwell Property Group. The difference between what the property is actually worth and what Blue Ridge pays for it effectively transfers money to the Wren entity, which then routes it to Solace Pacific. So the real estate transactions are the laundering mechanism. For lack of a more technical term, yes. There was a silence in the room. The heating system clicked. Patrick's pen rested on the edge of the desk. How many transactions? Vivian asked. Patrick looked at her. I've documented 19 so far, over a period of approximately 6 years. The total amount transferred via this mechanism, beyond the direct capitalization of Solace Pacific, is approximately $800,000. The number landed in the room and settled. So the total hidden asset value, Renata said carefully, is not $4 million. The total is closer to 4.9, possibly 5, depending on the current market value of certain Solace Pacific holdings. Vivian looked at the plant on Renata's windowsill. It was a peace lily, she had realized, at some point. The kind that thrives in indirect light and consistent watering, that gives no particular indication of its resilience until you understand what it takes to keep it alive in a windowsill office with artificially maintained temperature and no direct sun. Does Hale know about the secondary structure? She asked. I would be surprised, Patrick said. The obfuscation is quite well constructed. He would need to know what he was looking for to find it. He doesn't know what he's looking for, Vivian said, because he doesn't know there's anything to look for. Patrick looked at Renata. Renata clicked her pen twice. We have enough, Renata said. The thing about agreeing to $500 a month was that it required a particular internal discipline that Vivian had not entirely anticipated. Not because the number wounded her ego, she had processed that possibility and found it empty, but because the act of agreeing required her to perform, in front of Daniel and Jeffrey Hale and the mediator and anyone else present, a very specific brand of resignation. The kind that comes from someone who has tried and failed, who has weighed her options and found them wanting, who has decided that this small, inadequate number is better than the cost of fighting for more. She was a good performer. She had not known that about herself before. In the first life, she had been, she thought, fairly transparent, her feelings legible on her face, and her thoughts close enough to the surface to be read by people who were paying attention. She had taken a kind of pride in that, in being readable, in inhabiting an emotional life that was genuine and unguarded. The second life had taught her something about the uses of opacity. She had practiced the resignation in the mirror. Not in a melodramatic way, not scripting lines or rehearsing expressions, but in the way that athletes practice movements until they become reflexive. She had stood in the bathroom of the apartment and looked at herself and thought, what does a woman who is giving up look like? Not theatrically, not the collapsed posture and wet eyes of someone in a film. The real version, but the version that comes after the crying, has stopped, and the decisions have been made, and the only thing left is the dull, pragmatic work of agreement. That version was very still. That version had a quality of flatness around the eyes. That version sat across the table from Jeffrey Hale and said, "The terms are acceptable," in a voice that contained no particular information. She had given that performance for 40 minutes in the conference room. It had worked. Before we conclude, there is one additional matter. Renata's voice was so even, so completely calibrated, that for a moment the sentence almost didn't register. Jeffrey Hale looked up from his papers. Daniel's hands, which had been resting on the table in the loose, open posture of a man in the final moments of something he wants to be done with, went very slightly still. "We believe the settlement agreement, as currently structured, reflects an incomplete picture of the marital estate," Renata said. She opened the folder she had been holding in her lap, the folder that had been in her bag the entire meeting, that she had not opened or referenced or indicated the existence of in any way, and placed it on the table. "I'd like to direct counsel's attention to Exhibit A." Jeffrey Hale leaned forward. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at the top page of the document Renata had placed in front of him, which was a corporate registration document for Solace Pacific Holdings, LLC, Cayman Islands, with Thomas Wren listed as beneficial owner of record. The room's temperature seemed to drop by 2 degrees. Daniel did not look at the document. He looked at Vivian. She looked back. She kept her face completely flat and thought about nothing. "This is a Cayman Islands holding company," Jeffrey said in a tone that was carefully neutral but contained, Vivian noted, a thread of something thin and high, the sound a wire makes when it's bearing more weight than it was built for. "I'm not certain of the relevance." "The relevance," Renata said, "is that this entity holds approximately $4.1 million in assets and that its capitalization can be traced through a documented series of transfers to 2 domestic limited liability companies, Caldwell Property Group and Blue Ridge Capital Advisors, both of which are marital property." "Caldwell Property Group was formed prior to the marriage," Jeffrey said, with more confidence now, finding his footing. "The Caldwell Property Group was formed prior to the marriage, yes, but the asset growth occurring within Caldwell Property Group since the marriage date, growth directly attributable to business activities conducted during the marriage, is subject to marital estate classification under state equitable distribution law. The transfers to Solace Pacific, which began 14 months into the marriage, include both pre- and post-marital funds in a proportion that our forensic accountant has documented in detail." Renata turned the page. Exhibit B. Exhibit B was Patrick Seo's analysis. 63 pages, with supporting documentation cross-referenced and numbered. Jeffrey Hale looked at 63 pages and said nothing for a moment that lasted, Vivian estimated, approximately 8 seconds. And 8 seconds was a long time for a senior partner at a firm like Hale Whitmore. "I'll need time to review this material," he said finally. "Of course," Renata said. "We would expect that. I want to be clear that what we're presenting today is not a negotiating position. It's a preliminary disclosure ahead of our motion to set aside the settlement agreement on the grounds of material non-disclosure. We're giving you the opportunity to see this before we file, as a professional courtesy." The phrase professional courtesy was a very precise choice. It meant, we are not negotiating. We are telling you what is about to happen to your client. We are offering you the chance to manage that information before it becomes a public court filing. Daniel had still not looked away from Vivian. She had still not changed the expression on her face. And she was thinking about the east-facing windows of the apartment, about the specific quality of morning light that had become, over the past 3 months, something close to a compass point, the daily proof that she had survived the night and that the day was going to be, once again, hers. "There's also the matter of the consulting payments," Renata said, turning another page. Jeffrey Hale, who had been managing his expression with considerable effort, experienced a small, involuntary compression of his eyelids. It was not quite a blink. It was the physical equivalent of a stammer. "Consulting payments," he repeated. "To a third party." Renata said pleasantly. Totaling $340,000 routed through the marital estate LLCs and mischaracterized as business expenses. Exhibit C covers that in detail. We've also identified a secondary transfer mechanism. I believe Mr. Seo describes it as a paired real estate transaction structure that transferred an additional $840,000 through Solace Pacific over approximately 6 years. Exhibit D. She placed Exhibit D on top of Exhibit C on top of Exhibit B. The pile was approximately 1.5 inches thick. Jeffrey Hale looked at the pile. He looked at Daniel. Daniel had finally stopped looking at Vivian. He was looking at the settlement agreement, the cream-colored paper that he had been so relieved to see her sign 35 minutes ago, with the expression of a man reviewing a document that he has just realized said something completely different from what he thought it said. "I need to consult with my client," Jeffrey said. "Certainly," said Renata. So we'll wait." They left the room. The door closed. The room had the specific quality of silence that follows the departure of people who have been very loud, even though no one had raised their voice. Vivian looked at the settlement agreement on the table. The signature was clean. Renata's witness signature was next to it. "How long do you think?" she asked. Renata poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. 20 minutes, maybe 30. He needs to get the story out of Daniel, and that will take some time. "Do you think Daniel will tell him everything?" Renata considered this. "He'll tell him enough. The question is what Jeffrey decides to do with enough. Jeffrey will tell him to settle. Jeffrey will tell him to settle." Renata drank her water. So the question is whether Daniel will take the advice. He would not take the advice immediately. That was not how Daniel worked. What he would do, what he did in the 26 days between the courthouse meeting and the phone call that Renata received from Jeffrey Hale's office, was cycle through the stages of a man who believed that his intelligence could outmaneuver a problem that his intelligence had created. He would consult other lawyers. He would have Thomas Wren make inquiries about the legal protections of Cayman Island structures. He would call Robert Fitch, who would have the least useful conversation of Robert Fitch's professional career, because Robert Fitch was a man who had spent 11 years being careful precisely in order to be able to say, if it came to this, that he had done everything properly, and he wasn't sure what she was referring to. Vivian knew all of this was happening in the same way that she knew many things now, not through surveillance or direct intelligence, but through an understanding of Daniel's decision-making process that had been built over 8 years and refined over 18 months of watching him without letting him know she was watching. She went to work during those 26 days. Not the kind of work that involved Daniel. That was Renata's territory now, and she trusted Renata with a completeness that surprised her. The way that a person who has learned to be self-reliant is surprised by the relief of having someone competent in their corner. She worked on herself, on the version of herself that was going to exist after this was resolved. So she enrolled in a certification program in financial forensics at a university extension school. She chose it partly for practical reasons. She had found, in the months of building this case, that the most useful language she had was financial, that the ability to read a corporate structure and understand what it was designed to do was a form of power she intended to keep, and partly for a reason she did not examine too closely, which was that the idea of returning to pharmaceutical supply chain management felt like wearing a coat she had outgrown. She also, in week 3 of those 26 days, called Claudette Osei. Claudette answered on the second ring, the way she always did, with the business-like energy of someone who treated phone calls as transactions. "Vivian, I heard you were in mediation." "Finalized, actually. Or close to it." "How close?" "Renata has filed the motion. We're waiting to see if the other side wants to fight it or settle." There was a pause. Claudette had known about the case. Not the details, but the broad shape, since Vivian had first told her she was hiring Renata. Claudette had simply said, "Good," in the same tone she used when a grant application came through. "He's going to fight it," Claudette said now. "Men like that always fight it." "For a little while," Vivian said. "Then they don't." Jeffrey Hale's call came on a Tuesday. Renata took it in her office with the door closed and Vivian on a second line, per their agreement. Jeffrey had prepared his tone carefully, still collegial, professional, the register of a man who was managing an inconvenient situation rather than responding to a catastrophic one. "Oh, we'd like to discuss a resolution," he said. "We're open to that," Renata said. "My client is prepared to revisit the settlement structure in light of the new information. He acknowledges that there may be assets that were not fully disclosed in the initial process." "Maybe," Renata said, in a tone that did not allow the phrase to go unremarked without explicitly challenging it. "There were assets not fully disclosed," Jeffrey corrected himself, with the sound of a man who was learning to be precise. "My client is prepared to address that. We'd propose a revised spousal support figure and a lump sum property distribution." "What figures does your client have in mind?" A pause. "He's prepared to offer $200,000 as a lump sum distribution, with a revised spousal support figure of $3,000 per month for a period of 5 years. Renata looked at Vivian across the room. Vivian shook her head. "That's not a figure we can accept," Renata said. "Our motion documents a marital estate asset value of approximately $5 million in addition to the disclosed assets. Under equitable distribution, Ms. Cole's interest in those assets is substantial. We're not in a negotiation about the number. We're in a discussion about whether your client would prefer to resolve this privately or in court." Another pause. Longer. "What would resolution look like?" Jeffrey said carefully. "From your client's perspective." Renata had prepared for this question with Vivian the night before. They had sat in Renata's office until 10 p.m., Oz with takeout containers on the corner of the desk and the whiteboard covered in numbers, working through scenarios, stress testing positions, building the framework of a demand that was both aggressive and defensible. 40% of the total documented hidden asset value, Renata said, representing Ms. Cole's equitable share of the marital portion of those assets, net of your client's premarital contributions. That comes to approximately $1.8 million. Additionally, the spousal support agreement is voided and replaced with a 5-year support arrangement at $6,500 per month. Additionally, Ms. Cole is to be removed from any potential liability arising from the fraudulent transfer structure, including any tax liability that may attach to the improper expense characterizations. The last point was important. It was the point Vivian had identified. One of the risks of being married to a man who had run a fraudulent financial structure was that the IRS, when it eventually noticed, and it would notice because forensic accountant reports had a way of reaching regulatory bodies through various channels, might consider the marital estate jointly liable. She was not going to exit this marriage carrying the debt of his fraud. "That's a significant ask," Jeffrey said. "It reflects the documented facts." A longer pause. Vivian could hear, or imagined she could hear, the specific quality of a man calculating. I'll convey it to my client," Jeffrey said. "You have 7 days before we file," Renata said. After that, the conversation moves to the court record. He took 6 of the 7 days. Vivian spent them in the apartment with the east-facing windows, attending her financial forensics classes, and reading and running in the mornings, and not, she was careful about this, not anticipating. She had learned in the months of the second life to be suspicious of anticipation. It was too close to hope, and hope had a way of distorting your read on a situation. What she needed and cultivated was readiness, a state that was not emotional but structural. The wire held taut. On the 6th day, her phone rang at 7:40 in the evening. It was Renata. "They accepted," she said. She said it the way she said most things, levelly, without inflection. But there was something under the levelness that Vivian had come to recognize over the months as the particular satisfaction of a person who does a difficult thing well. Vivian was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee. She looked at the counter for a moment. The surface was clean. She kept things clean now. "Terms? 1.75, which is $25,000 less than we asked for. I recommended we accept. It's not worth the filing over. $6,200 per month for 5 years on the support. The liability indemnification clause is in." "The indemnification clause is in?" "Yes." Jeffrey pushed back on it 3 times. I held. "The tax exposure?" "He's responsible for all of it. The clause is explicit. He's to cooperate with any regulatory inquiry arising from the Solace Pacific structure. And he's to bear all costs and penalties associated with the fraudulent transfer characterizations." Vivian drank her coffee. It was the good kind she had bought at a shop 6 blocks from the apartment, single origin, ground fresh. The kind of small extravagance she had started allowing herself as a deliberate practice of acknowledging that she was still here. "Renata," she said. "Yes." "The service record? The mechanic's report?" A pause. This was not something they had discussed in the context of the settlement. It was the thing she had held, very carefully, separate from the financial case. The piece that was not about money, that was about a Tuesday in February on Route 9. "I have it," Renata said, "along with the statement from the mechanic's assistant who did the service. Oh, I referred the matter to someone I trust 3 weeks ago." "Who?" "A detective in the county prosecutor's office. She handles financial crimes primarily, but she's experienced with cases that cross lines." "Does she know?" "She knows what the evidence supports, which is a vehicle service performed 3 weeks before an accident, incomplete torquing of the steering column, an accident on a dry road in good visibility that resulted in—" Renata paused. In the second life, the crash had not happened. There was no accident to refer to. The evidence existed only as a potential, as a thing that had been prepared and not executed because Vivian had not given it the opportunity to be executed because she had known it was coming. "She knows what the evidence supports in the context of your prior concerns about your husband's actions." "What does she think?" "She thinks," Renata said carefully, "that it warrants further inquiry." Vivian set down her coffee cup. "Okay," she said. "Okay," said Renata. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of 2 people sitting in the same room with a very large and very complicated thing and choosing for the moment not to speak about it. "The money transfers on Monday," Renata said. "I'll send you the confirmation." "Thank you," said Vivian. She ended the call. She stood at the kitchen counter for a while. The apartment was quiet. The windows were dark now, the east-facing windows with the city's ambient light giving the glass a faint orange quality, and the way cities look from inside at night, the aggregated warmth of a million lit rooms, impersonal and somehow comforting. She thought about the first life, not with grief. She had finished grieving it a long time ago, somewhere around the 5th month of the second life, when she had woken up one morning and noticed that the specific weight of it had lifted, that the thing she carried now was not grief, but information. The first life was data. It was the raw material of the second one. She thought about the woman she had been, the woman who had stood at a different kitchen counter in a darker house, making dinner for a man who was at a squash match and whose phone was face down on the kitchen table. She had been good, that woman. She had been genuinely good, and it had not protected her. She did not wish she had been different. And that was the clearest thought she had about it. She did not wish she had been less open, less willing to believe, less willing to build a life around the materials she'd been given. That woman's openness was not the cause of what had happened to her. The cause of what had happened to her was a man who had decided she was more useful dead than divorced, and who had been wrong about the costs and benefits of that calculation in a way he was now in the process of discovering. She washed her coffee cup, dried it, put it back in the cabinet. The money arrived in her account at 11:17 on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after Jeffrey Hale's call, 1 week after the revised settlement agreement was signed with all 3 parties present, and a court reporter documenting every word. The notification came as a text from her bank. The standard automated format. A deposit in the amount of $1,750,000. She was in a forensic accounting lecture when it arrived. She looked at her phone under the desk, read the notification, and looked back up at the whiteboard where the professor was drawing a diagram of a financial flow-through structure that bore, she noticed, some mild resemblance to the Blue Ridge Capital model at a much smaller scale, used here as a teaching example of improper expense allocation. She thought, "I know this material." She put her phone back in her bag. After class, she walked to a coffee shop on a street she had not been to before. She made a habit of finding new streets now, of not allowing her geography to become routine, and sat by the window with a cortado and her laptop and reviewed the documentation that Renata had sent over. There's the full settlement agreement, the indemnification clause, the payment confirmation, the schedule for the ongoing monthly support. Everything was in order. She opened a separate document, the journal she had kept since October of the second year. the ledger of names and dates and financial structures, and added a final entry. Not a conclusion, exactly. The investigation into the steering column was ongoing. There were things she was still waiting for, threads that were still being followed by the detective in the county prosecutor's office, by Patrick Seo, by Renata's network of investigators who had, in the months of building the financial case, accumulated other kinds of information as well. She wrote, "Settlement complete. 1.75 received. Monthly support begins in 30 days. Tax liability indemnification in place. Ongoing. Criminal inquiry referral per R status T BD." She closed the journal. She looked out the window at the street, which was unfamiliar, which was ordinary, which was the city doing its daily work of being itself, regardless of what she had been through. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man in a delivery uniform locked his truck. Two teenagers moved down the sidewalk in the particular boneless amble of people with nowhere urgent to be. She thought about the phrase Claudette had used early on, "You already know where the body is buried." She thought about how true that was, and how the metaphor had bent, over the course of the second life, into something that was not quite metaphorical. The body was hers. The burial had been planned. She was sitting in a coffee shop on an unfamiliar street with a cortado and an encrypted journal and $1.75 million. The body had decided not to cooperate. 3 weeks after the settlement, Vivian received a call from Renata on a Saturday morning. She was running 4 miles, the usual route, in the November cold that had settled over the city with the abrupt authority of a season that was done being gradual. She had her earbuds in, but her phone set to allow calls, and when Renata's name came up, she stopped at the corner by the community garden. Dormant now, the beds covered in dark fabric, the tool shed padlocked, and answered. "The detective made contact with Robert Fitch yesterday," Renata said. Vivian's breath was still elevated from the run. She stood on the corner and controlled it. "And?" "He didn't lawyer up immediately. He answered questions for about 40 minutes. I don't have the content of that conversation, but my source tells me he was cooperative." "The mechanic?" "The assistant mechanic, the one who actually performed the service, has been interviewed twice. He's 26 years old, and he is, apparently, very frightened." Vivian looked at the padlocked tool shed. The lock was a combination type, the kind with a dial. She thought about the specific physics of a steering column and what you had to know to make it fail in a particular way, on a particular kind of road, in particular conditions. "Is there enough?" she asked. Renata paused in the way she paused when she was being precise. "There is beginning to be enough." Beginning to be enough was not a legal standard. Unless it was not a phrase Renata used casually, she used it to mean, the structure is visible, we can see the shape of it, the evidence is finding its form. "Okay," Vivian said. "I want to be clear about what this means," Renata said, and her voice had taken on a quality that Vivian had not heard before. Not warm, exactly, but careful in the way of someone who is handling something that has weight. "If this proceeds, it proceeds as a criminal matter, not a civil one, not something we control. It goes to the prosecutor's office and it moves on their timeline." "I understand. You may be called as a witness. Your prior testimony, the financial investigation, all of it enters the record." "I understand." "And the outcome?" "Renata." Vivian stopped her. "I know the outcome isn't guaranteed. I'm not expecting a guarantee. I'm expecting the right people to have the right information." Another pause, the kind that felt like a breath. "Yes," Renata said. "That's right." Vivian ended the call. She stood on the corner for another moment, her breath visible in the cold air, the tool shed padlocked in front of her, the garden dormant and dark and completely uninterested in her presence. The city made its usual sounds around her. Traffic, voices from somewhere, the specific ambient, low-frequency hum of a large number of people conducting their lives. She put her earbuds back in, found her place in the route, started running again. The call from Jeffrey Hale came on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the settlement, at 9:15 in the morning. Renata's assistant forwarded it to Vivian per their standing arrangement. Jeffrey's voice had lost the careful professionalism of the settlement proceedings. It was still controlled. He was a controlled man by nature. But the control had a different quality now. the quality of control being maintained under conditions that had not been anticipated. "I've been informed," he said, "that my client is under criminal investigation." "I see," Renata said. Her voice was completely even. She sounded, as she always did in these moments, like someone hearing information she had already processed. "I'd like to understand Ms. Cole's involvement in that investigation." Ms. Cole cooperated with investigators to the extent that she was legally required and ethically obligated to do, as did I. The financial records were disclosed pursuant to proper legal channels, Jeffrey. You have the same records. A pause. So he believes she orchestrated this. "Your client," Renata said, with a precision that gave each word a separate weight, structured approximately $5 million in fraudulent asset concealment across a 6-year period. He engaged in a marital estate fraud that predated the separation by nearly 4 years. The documentation of that fraud, which my client obtained through legitimate means, was provided to the appropriate authorities as part of the normal operation of the legal process. What your client believes about the orchestration of his own accountability is not particularly relevant to the facts." Silence. "She accepted the settlement," Jeffrey said, and there was something in his voice now that was almost, not quite, but almost, the register of a man working through something he did not understand. "She did," Renata said. "I used the $500. She accepted it as the terms available to her at that stage of the process," Renata said. "The settlement was subsequently revisited in light of material information that was not available at the time of signing. That's what the legal process is designed for. Your client had multiple opportunities to disclose fully. He chose not to." Another silence. Longer. "What does she want?" Jeffrey said. It was not a legal question. It had the naked quality of a personal one, of a man who had been in the room with Vivian for 40 minutes and watched her sign a document she had known the entire time was the opening move of something she had already mapped entirely, asking what the endgame had been. Renata looked across the room at Vivian, who was sitting in the chair she always sat in. Was by the plant on the windowsill, with her hands in her lap and her expression doing nothing at all. Vivian said, quietly, just loud enough for the phone to pick up, "She already has it." Daniel Cole was formally charged 14 weeks later. 3 counts of fraudulent transfer under the State Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act. 2 counts relating to the improper expense characterizations, which the IRS had entered as a parallel matter. 1 count, and this was the one that the detective in the county prosecutor's office had spent the most time on, the one that rested on the 26-year-old assistant mechanic's increasingly detailed account, and on Robert Fitch's eventual cooperation, which had been extensive once his own attorney had explained to him what extensive cooperation meant for his own exposure. 1 count of conduct with reckless disregard for human life, arising from the state of a specific vehicle's steering mechanism and a specific Tuesday in February of a year that, in this version of events, had not yet happened. The charge was conspiracy to commit. The February crash had not occurred. Vivian was alive. The crime, in the strictest sense, was prospective. A plan that had been interrupted before execution, documented by physical evidence and testimony, but lacking its intended outcome. This created a complicated legal situation that Renata explained to her in careful, precise language over 2 sessions, the upshot of which was it would be difficult to prosecute fully. The conspiracy charge would likely survive. The outcome was uncertain. Vivian had sat with this information and examined it from several angles. "He'll spend considerable money on his defense," she said. "Yes." "Which comes out of the disclosed assets, the ones that remained after the settlement." "Yes." "And the IRS matter will consume additional resources." "Considerably." "And the criminal record, even if the outcome is a reduced charge, a plea, affects his professional standing, his ability to hold certain licenses, his relationships with investors." Renata looked at her. "Yes, all of that." Vivian looked at the plant on the windowsill. "That's sufficient," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not closure. It was a calculation, and the calculation was complete. She graduated from the Financial Forensics Certification Program in June. The ceremony was unremarkable. A ballroom in a hotel downtown, folding chairs, a dean who spoke at length about the importance of integrity in the financial sector, which struck Vivian as both relevant and slightly inadequate to the moment. Her classmates were a mix of career changers and professionals adding credentials. 3 accountants, a banker, 2 lawyers, a former middle school math teacher who had decided she wanted to do something with numbers that felt consequential. Vivian talked to the middle school teacher after the ceremony over wine and the small crab appetizers that had been provided with more ambition than success. Her name was Daria. Since she was funny and direct and had a way of explaining her career change that was practical to the point of poetry. "I wanted to find the lie in the numbers," she said. "Middle schoolers lie about their homework. It's the same skill, just with more zeros." Vivian had laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that caught her slightly off guard with its own completeness. Daria looked at her with the friendly assessment of someone who had been watching people all week. "You're good at this," she said. "The forensic stuff. You have the instinct for it." "I had good material to practice on." "Your own case?" "Something like that." Daria nodded, accepting the ellipsis. "What are you going to do with it?" Vivian drank her wine. The ballroom's light was warm, the late afternoon version of June that comes through tall windows at a golden angle. The specific quality that makes ordinary rooms look briefly like something you might want to remember. "I've been talking to Renata, my attorney, about a consulting arrangement," she said. "She handles a lot of high-asset divorce cases. The asset discovery work is often the linchpin." "So you'd work with her?" "As an independent consultant initially. We'd see how it goes." Daria raised her glass. "To finding the lie in the numbers." Vivian raised hers. "To the numbers." The apartment with the east-facing windows became, over the following months, the kind of home that forms around a person rather than being chosen for them. She added a second plant, a trailing pothos that went on the bookshelf, which she discovered she found pleasant for no reason she could articulate beyond the fact of its presence. She kept the coffee maker she had brought from the house on Caldwell Drive, which was the only thing from the first life she had retained. Not sentimentally, but because it was a good coffee maker, and there was no reason to waste a good coffee maker. She ran her 4 miles. She read widely. She built, slowly and with considerable care, a professional practice that used everything she had learned in the strange prolonged education of the second life, the forensic accounting, the understanding of shell structures and transfer mechanisms, the specific language of financial fraud and its detection. Renata referred 4 cases in the first 6 months. Each one involved a high net worth marital estate. Each one involved, to varying degrees, a partner who had believed the other partner would not know what to look for. They always underestimated. She found this, if not exactly satisfying, then functionally clarifying. The pattern was consistent enough to be useful. Men, and it was mostly men, though not exclusively, who had constructed financial secrets within their marriages, operated from a foundational assumption about the people they were hiding from. The assumption was that proximity created blindness, that intimacy was a form of distraction, that the person who knew them best would, paradoxically, see them least clearly. It was a reasonable assumption. It had worked, historically, often enough to become doctrine. It had not worked on her. What she had learned in the second life was not a strategy. It was something simpler and more structural than a strategy. It was the understanding that the most useful thing you can do with a painful knowledge is make it precise. Not sharper. Precision was not the same as sharpness. Precise meant accurate, measured, correct in its dimensions. You knew what you knew, and you did not add to it or subtract from it based on what you wished were true. She had known what was behind the closed doors of her marriage. In the second life, from the very first morning, she had not allowed herself to forget it, even on the days when forgetting would have been easier. She had stayed with the knowledge, measured it, applied it correctly. The rest, as Renata would say, was documentation. On a Thursday in November, 14 months after the courthouse, Vivian received a call from the detective who had been handling the steering column matter. She was in her office, a small one, in a building 3 blocks from Renata's, with the late afternoon light coming through the window at the particular angle that reminded her, every day at 4 o'clock, that she was in a room that was hers. "The plea agreement came through this morning," the detective said. Her name was Holloway, and she had the specific vocal quality of someone who had spent a long time delivering information that mattered to people who had been waiting for it. Direct, unhurried, the voice of someone who understood that the person on the other end did not need embellishment. He accepted 2 counts, the fraudulent transfer and the conspiracy. 18 months, 6 suspended, eligible for release in 8. Vivian wrote the numbers on the notepad on her desk. 18. 6 suspended, 8 minimum. The sentence is concurrent with the IRS matter, Holloway continued. Oh, that's a separate resolution, but the timing aligns. He's also entered into a civil settlement with the county on some related matters. The third party, Vivian said, the consultant. Yes, she entered her own agreement 6 weeks ago. No criminal charges, civil liability only. She cooperated fully. Vivian looked at the numbers on the notepad. Detective Holloway, she said. Ms. Cole. Thank you. A pause. The detective had not been effusive at any point in their 14-month professional relationship. She was not effusive now. It's the job, Holloway said. Vivian ended the call. She sat at her desk with the notepad in front of her and looked at the numbers for a while. 18, 6 suspended, 8 minimum. They were not the numbers she might have imagined in the first weeks of the second life. But when she had lain awake in the house on Caldwell Drive and thought, with the raw and uncalibrated anger of someone who had recently been killed, and found themselves inexplicably alive again, about what she wanted. She had not known then what she wanted. She had known only that something had to be accounted for, that the full price of what had been done to her had to be visible somewhere, in some record acknowledged by some system larger than her own memory. The record existed. The system had acknowledged it. She picked up her pen. Not to write, to hold. The weight of it. A small and specific and ordinary weight. The weight of a tool in the hand of someone who knows what it's for. She put the notepad in the desk drawer and went back to work. On her desk, open on her laptop, Owl was a financial structure belonging to a real estate holding company in the northern part of the state. The company's books had been submitted as part of a marital estate disclosure in a divorce proceeding filed the previous month. The wife's attorney had referred the matter to Vivian with a note that said simply, "Something's off." She had been looking at the structure for 2 hours. She had found the thing that was off in the 45th minute and had since been documenting it with the patient. Methodical attention of someone who understood that what you do with a finding is not announce it. What you do with a finding is prove it. Completely, in a way that cannot be explained away or reframed or walked back under the pressure of a confident lawyer with cream-colored paper. You build the case until the case is built. As then you walk into a room with a folder in your lap and you wait for the right moment. And when the right moment comes, you say, "Before we conclude, there is one additional matter." She clicked through to the next page of the financial documents, poured the last of her coffee, and kept reading.